It was a brisk fall morning in the small town of Oak Ridge, a quiet suburban neighborhood where families live peaceful lives, tucked away from the bustle of the city. The streets were lined with tall oaks whose leaves had turned amber and gold, signaling the season's change. On the outside, Oak Ridge seemed like any other typical American town, perfectly ordinary with children riding their bikes and neighbors greeting each other with warm smiles. But beneath its peaceful surface, Oak Ridge harbored secrets, dark ones. Detective Sarah Carter had been with the Oak Ridge Police Department for almost 10 years. Her reputation as a seasoned investigator was well known across the department. She was sharp, methodical, and had a nose for detecting lies. Yet she had never encountered a case like the one that landed on her desk that chilly October morning. A 911 call had come in the night before, reporting the death of Samuel Grayson, a successful real estate developer in his mid-40s. He was found in his upscale home, sprawled out on the floor of his living room with multiple gunshot wounds to his chest. No signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle. His wife, Claire, was the one who had called the police. She claimed to have heard the shots from upstairs and rushed down to find her husband dead. Sarah arrived at the scene shortly after the initial investigation began. The house was massive, with tall ceilings and marble floors that gleamed under the dim lighting. As she entered, she couldn't help but notice the pristine, almost clinical cleanliness of the home. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee, and the silence felt oppressive. The scene was eerily calm for a murder scene, almost too perfect. Claire Grayson, the wife of the deceased, was sitting on the couch in the living room when Sarah walked in. She looked composed, her makeup flawless, her dark hair perfectly styled. Despite her calm demeanor, Sarah could see the faintest tremble in her hands as Claire held a cup of tea. She was the picture of a grieving widow, yet something about her behavior seemed off. She wasn't crying, nor did she appear shocked, just matter of fact. "Mrs. Grayson," Sarah began, her voice steady and professional, "I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you a few questions." Claire nodded and wiped her eyes, giving an almost exaggerated look of sorrow. "Of course, Detective. I'll help however I can. Start by telling me what happened last night." Claire took a slow breath and began recounting the events. She explained that she had been in their bedroom on the second floor, reading a book, when she heard the shots. In a panic, she rushed downstairs to find her husband lying on the floor, already gone. She immediately called 911. "I didn't hear anyone in the house. I didn't see anything suspicious. It all happened so fast," Claire said, her voice soft but controlled. Sarah listened carefully, noting the lack of emotion in Claire's voice. A part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. In her years of experience, she had learned to trust her instincts. This case had all the hallmarks of a classic spouse killed by an intruder scenario, but something about Claire's behavior, the calmness in her demeanor, made Sarah suspicious. As she continued to ask questions, she began to notice small details that seemed off. The fact that Claire mentioned hearing the gunshots but didn't seem startled by them. The fact that she had gone down to check on her husband immediately, without any sign of panic. It all felt too rehearsed, too perfect. After the initial questioning, Sarah asked to speak with the detectives handling the crime scene. She was led to the back of the house, where the body of Samuel Grayson lay. It was a gruesome sight. The bloodstains had already begun to seep into the expensive rug beneath him. Multiple gunshot wounds on his chest indicated that the killer had fired at close range, but there was no sign of struggle. No fingerprints on the weapon, nothing to suggest a robbery gone wrong or an intruder's attack. As Sarah inspected the body, her mind raced. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. Samuel Grayson hadn't put up a fight. Could it have been someone he knew? Someone he trusted? A lover, perhaps. The thought gnawed at Sarah. There was something about this case that didn't sit right with her. She needed to know more about the Grayson marriage, and to do that, she would have to dig deeper. Sarah began her investigation into Samuel and Claire's relationship, looking for any clues that might shed light on why someone would want to kill Samuel. What she found was a relationship that had been far from typical. It turned out that the Graysons were in what some might call an open marriage. While Claire and Samuel had been married for over 15 years, Their relationship had been unconventional. Both had agreed to date other people, but they always remained committed to each other. Their arrangement was mutual, and both had seemed to be content with it, at least outwardly. But as Sarah delved further into the details, she discovered that Claire's affairs had become a regular part of her life. She was a known socialite, attending exclusive parties, and had been linked to several men over the years, both in the business world and beyond. There were rumors that some of her lovers were well connected, even dangerous. Sarah's suspicions began to mount. Was it possible that one of Claire's lovers had become jealous? Had a fight over her affections escalated into murder? The deeper Sarah went into the case, the more questions emerged. Claire Grayson was hiding something. Her perfect act of grief was just that, an act, and Sarah was determined to find out what it was. As she continued to piece together the clues, Sarah learned that Claire had been spending a lot of time with one particular man in the weeks leading up to Samuel's death. His name was Jack Thornton, a local businessman with a reputation for being ruthless. He was known for his temper, and Sarah quickly discovered that he had a troubled past, one that involved violent outbursts and an unhealthy obsession with Claire. Could Jack Thornton be the one who had killed Samuel Grayson? Had Claire's affair with him led to murder? These were the questions that Sarah was now determined to answer. Detective Sarah Carter spent the next few days delving deeper into the life of Claire Grayson and her entanglement with Jack Thornton. The more she uncovered, the more the case began to take shape, revealing a troubling web of deceit, betrayal, and unspoken motivations. The first thing Sarah did was speak to the neighbors. Oak Ridge was a tight-knit community, and people usually knew what was going on in each other's lives, even if they didn't always talk about it openly. Sarah was hoping to find a clue, any hint that might explain what had led to Samuel Grayson's tragic death. Mrs. Jenkins, who lived 2 doors down from the Graysons, was more than willing to talk. She had seen Claire and Jack together on several occasions over the past month. The two had been seen leaving the Grayson home together late at night more than once, always in a hurry, almost as if they were trying to avoid being seen. Mrs. Jenkins mentioned that Claire had always been careful about her public appearances, but there was a noticeable change recently. "Claire's been different," Mrs. Jenkins remarked, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "She used to be the perfect wife, always put together, always with Samuel. But lately, there's been more tension. And that Jack Thornton, I don't trust him. There's something about him that doesn't sit right with me." Sarah noted the suspicion in Mrs. Jenkins' voice. It was clear that Jack Thornton was not a favorite among the neighbors, but the key detail was Claire's behavior. The fact that she had been spending more time with Jack was not a surprise, but the increased secrecy surrounding their meetings raised red flags for Sarah. Her next stop was the local cafe, a popular hangout spot for residents of Oak Ridge. Sarah had learned that Jack Thornton often visited there to meet people in the business community, but it was also a place where he occasionally ran into Claire. It was a neutral ground where they could be seen but still maintain an air of discretion. When Sarah entered the cafe, she was greeted by the barista, who recognized her immediately. After a few polite pleasantries, Sarah asked if the barista had seen Jack and Claire together recently. The young woman's expression shifted as she recalled a recent encounter. "Yeah, they were here just last week," she said. "They looked pretty cozy, but they weren't acting like a typical couple. More like business partners, if you know what I mean. They were talking in low voices, like they didn't want anyone to overhear." Sarah pressed for more details. The barista mentioned that Jack seemed particularly on edge during their meeting, as if he were agitated about something. There was one moment when he slammed his fist on the table, which caused a few people to glance over. Claire, however, remained calm and collected, as if she was used to his outbursts. "That doesn't sound like a typical meeting between lovers," Sarah thought, making a mental note. The fact that Jack had a temper wasn't new information, but hearing that he had lost control in public was a piece of the puzzle she hadn't anticipated. Perhaps the affair wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Sarah's next step was to learn more about Jack Thornton's background. She pulled up his criminal record and found that, although he had no convictions, his history was far from clean. Jack had been involved in a number of heated disputes in the past, both personal and business-related. There were allegations of intimidation, blackmail, and even suspected ties to organized crime. However, nothing had ever been proven. Jack was skilled at staying just on the right side of the law. But as Sarah dug further, she discovered something even more chilling. Jack Thornton had been previously involved in a violent altercation with a former business partner, a man named Adam Lambert. Adam had accused Jack of threatening him and his family over a business deal gone wrong, though the case was dropped when Adam refused to press charges. Sarah was starting to get a clearer picture of Jack. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a man capable of violence, someone who could easily be driven to anger when things didn't go his way. And now he had been linked to Claire Grayson, a woman who had everything to gain from her husband's death. It was at this point that Sarah decided to take a closer look at Claire's financial records. If Claire and Jack were having an affair, she reasoned, there might be a financial incentive that went beyond simple passion. Perhaps Claire stood to benefit financially from her husband's death, and Jack might have been involved in a plan to eliminate Samuel. After gaining access to the Graysons' financial statements, Sarah noticed a series of large transfers between Claire's bank account and a private offshore account. The transfers were recent, all made within the last few months. Claire had been funneling money into the account at an alarming rate, and the amounts were significant. One transfer stood out in particular, a large sum sent to an account that was registered in a name Sarah didn't recognize. James Barrett. The account was based in the Cayman Islands. Sarah's mind raced. Who was James Barrett? And why was Claire sending him money? It wasn't until Sarah reached out to the Graysons' lawyer that the first real breakthrough came. When she asked about the offshore account, the lawyer seemed hesitant at first, but under the pressure of Sarah's steady questioning, he eventually relented and provided some crucial information. James Barrett is Jack Thornton's alias, the lawyer admitted. It's a name he uses when he wants to hide certain transactions, usually for business dealings that he doesn't want the public to know about. The connection was clear now. Claire had been helping Jack launder money through her husband's wealth. It seemed that the affair wasn't just about love, it was about power, money, and control. Jack Thornton wasn't just involved with Claire romantically, he was involved with her financially too. Sarah's suspicions about Claire's involvement in her husband's death were now more than just gut feelings. They were based on solid evidence. Claire had been hiding her affair with Jack, and together they had been plotting something far more sinister. But the question remained, did Claire orchestrate Samuel Grayson's murder with Jack's help? Or had Jack acted on his own, driven by greed and jealousy? As Sarah prepared to confront Claire about the new evidence, she knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just a simple case of a wife mourning the loss of her husband. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that Claire Grayson had been hiding a deadly secret, and Sarah was determined to expose it, no matter what the cost. Detective Sarah Carter had always believed in the power of conversation to uncover truths hidden in plain sight. Armed with the evidence tying Claire Grayson and Jack Thornton together, she decided it was time to confront Claire. But Sarah knew she had to tread carefully. A direct accusation could cause Claire to shut down, and any chance of gleaning new information would be lost. Sarah arrived at the Grayson home unannounced. Claire answered the door, her appearance meticulously put together despite her recent loss. Her calm demeanor struck Sarah as calculated, a mask designed to deflect suspicion. "Detective Carter," Claire greeted, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. "I wasn't expecting you. I'd like to ask you a few more questions," Sarah replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "This won't take long." Claire nodded, gesturing for Sarah to sit. The two women settled in the living room, the tension between them palpable. Sarah began with casual questions, easing Claire into the conversation before steering it toward the damning evidence. "Claire, I've been reviewing some of Samuel's financial records," Sarah said, her tone even. "I noticed several transactions linked to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Do you know anything about that?" Claire's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "Samuel handled all our finances. I wouldn't know anything about offshore accounts." Sarah leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "That's interesting because the transfers were made from your personal account, and the account they were sent to is registered under an alias linked to Jack Thornton." The room fell silent. Claire's composure cracked as her hands fidgeted in her lap. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah pressed on. Claire, I know about your relationship with Jack. I've spoken to your neighbors and reviewed your financial records. I also know about Jack's violent tendencies. The question is, how far were you willing to go to be with him? Did you plan Samuel's murder together? Claire's face turned pale. You have no proof, she stammered. Sarah stood towering over Claire. Not yet, but I will. Leaving Claire visibly shaken, Sarah shifted her focus to Jack Thornton. She needed to question him directly, but she also knew he was a dangerous man who wouldn't respond well to intimidation. Sarah decided to pay a visit to Jack's business associates to gather more context about his character and his possible involvement in Samuel Grayson's murder. At a local construction site managed by one of Jack's companies, Sarah spoke to a foreman named Mike. He described Jack as a volatile boss who often resorted to threats to get his way. Jack's not someone you mess with, Mike said, glancing around nervously as if Jack could appear at any moment. He's got connections, people who'll do his dirty work for him. Have you heard anything about his relationship with Claire Grayson? Sarah asked. Mike hesitated before replying. I've seen them together a few times. Jack seemed protective of her, almost possessive. But it's not my place to say anything. Sarah's instincts told her that Jack's possessiveness might have been a driving force in Samuel's murder. She needed more concrete evidence to link Jack to the crime. But Mike's comments confirmed her suspicions that Jack wasn't just a casual lover. He was deeply invested in Claire, perhaps even obsessed. The breakthrough came when Sarah received a call from the forensic team. They had found traces of DNA under Samuel Grayson's fingernails that didn't match his own. The DNA was a match for Jack Thornton. With this crucial piece of evidence, Sarah obtained a warrant to bring Jack in for questioning. She knew Jack wouldn't go down without a fight, but she was prepared for whatever he had in store. When Sarah and her team arrived at Jack's office, he was caught off guard, but quickly masked his surprise with a smirk. Detective Carter, he drawled, to what do I owe the pleasure? We need to talk, Sarah said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Come with us. Jack's arrogance remained intact as he accompanied Sarah to the station. Once inside the interrogation room, however, his demeanor shifted. He knew the game was changing, and he didn't like losing control. Jack, we found your DNA under Samuel Grayson's fingernails, Sarah began, watching his reaction carefully. Care to explain how that happened? Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. Maybe we had a scuffle. Doesn't mean I killed him. Sarah leaned forward, her voice firm. This wasn't a scuffle, Jack. Samuel was murdered. His injuries indicate a brutal struggle, and your DNA puts you at the scene. Combine that with your financial ties to Claire, and it doesn't look good for you. Jack's jaw tightened. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out. But then he leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. You think you're so smart, don't you? But you don't know the half of it. As Sarah prepared to press Jack further, another officer interrupted the interrogation. Claire Grayson had arrived at the station, demanding to speak to Sarah. Sarah excused herself and found Claire pacing in the lobby, her face pale and drawn. I need to talk to you, Claire said urgently. Alone. Sarah led Claire to a private room where Claire broke down in tears. Jack killed Samuel, she admitted, but it wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Claire's confession spilled out in fragments, revealing a chilling truth. She and Jack had planned to blackmail Samuel into leaving her the bulk of his fortune, using fabricated evidence of an affair to force his hand. But when Samuel confronted Jack about the scheme, Jack lost control and killed him in a fit of rage. I didn't know he was going to kill him, Claire sobbed. I just wanted out. I wanted to be free. Sarah listened, her heart heavy with the weight of the revelations. Claire's betrayal ran deep, and while she hadn't physically committed the murder, her complicity was undeniable. Detective Sarah Carter knew she was dealing with a tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and violence. With Claire's partial confession, Jack Thornton's DNA evidence, and the financial ties linking the two suspects, Sarah was closer than ever to unraveling the case. But there were still unanswered questions. How much did Claire truly know about Jack's intentions? Was she a victim of his manipulation or a willing accomplice? And most importantly, could Sarah bring both of them to justice? Claire Grayson sat in the interrogation room, her eyes red from crying, but her composure more controlled than before. Sarah sat across from her, placing a recorder on the table. Claire, I need you to go through everything again, Sarah began, her tone firm but not harsh. From the beginning, how did you meet Jack Thornton? Claire sighed heavily, her hands trembling as she wrung them together. I met Jack about a year ago at a charity gala. Samuel and I were there together, but he spent most of the evening talking business. Jack, he paid attention to me. He made me feel seen. Did your relationship with him turn romantic immediately? Sarah asked. Claire hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I was unhappy in my marriage. Samuel and we drifted apart. Jack was different. He listened to me, made me feel alive again. But Jack isn't just a lover, Sarah pressed. He's violent, controlling. Did you ever see that side of him before Samuel's murder? Claire's gaze dropped to the table. I didn't want to see it. I knew he had a temper, but he promised me he'd change. I believed him. Sarah leaned forward. Claire, I don't think you're telling me the whole truth. Jack didn't just kill Samuel out of rage. There was a plan, wasn't there? A plan to get rid of Samuel and take his money. Claire's silence was damning. Finally, she whispered, I didn't want him dead. I just wanted to leave. While Claire wrestled with her guilt, Jack Thornton remained defiant in his own interrogation. He sat across from Sarah with a cocky grin, arms crossed as if the situation were merely an inconvenience. You're wasting your time, Jack sneered. You don't have enough to convict me. Oh, I think we do, Sarah shot back, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were photos of the crime scene, financial records, and screenshots of texts between Jack and Claire. Jack's smirk faltered as he flipped through the evidence. You think this scares me? He scoffed, though his bravado seemed forced. So I had some business with Claire. That doesn't make me a killer. It does when your DNA is under the victim's fingernails, Sarah countered, and when your financial records show payouts linked to Claire's accounts. You were planning something together, Jack. Did she put you up to it? Or was this all your idea? Jack slammed the folder shut, his face reddening. You don't know what you're talking about. Then enlighten me, Sarah challenged. Tell me why Samuel Grayson is dead. For the first time, Jack looked genuinely cornered. He clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he leaned across the table. You think Claire's innocent in all this? She's the one who wanted him gone. She came to me, crying about how miserable her life was. I just gave her what she wanted. While Sarah continued pressing Jack and Claire, the forensic team uncovered a crucial piece of evidence, the murder weapon. It was a blunt object, likely a wrench, found discarded in a dumpster near Jack's office. Blood residue on the weapon matched Samuel Grayson's DNA, and fingerprints belonging to Jack were found on the handle. This discovery solidified Jack's direct involvement in the murder, but it also raised new questions. Why would Jack dispose of the weapon so carelessly? Was it arrogance, or had he wanted it to be found? And if Claire had known about the murder, why hadn't she come forward sooner? Sarah called a meeting with her team to review the case. Together, they pieced together the timeline of events. Claire and Jack began their affair approximately a year before the murder. Financial records showed Claire transferring money to Jack in small increments over several months. Text messages between the two revealed discussions about Samuel's will and his assets. Jack's DNA and fingerprints tied him to the crime scene and the murder weapon. Despite the mounting evidence, there was still a missing link, a clear motive. Why had Jack chosen to kill Samuel instead of following through with the blackmail scheme? I think Jack acted impulsively, Sarah speculated, but Claire knew about the plan. Whether she intended for Samuel to die or not, she's just as guilty. The break in the case came when Sarah reviewed security footage from a nearby gas station on the night of the murder. The footage showed Jack's truck parked in the lot for over an hour, with Claire sitting in the passenger seat. While the camera didn't capture audio, their body language suggested an intense argument. In one frame, Claire handed Jack an envelope, which he tossed onto the dashboard before driving off. The forensic team analyzed the footage and determined that the envelope likely contained the cash Jack had been demanding from Claire. Sarah confronted Claire with the footage. You knew he was going to confront Samuel that night, Sarah said. What did you think was going to happen? I thought he'd scare him, that's all, Claire cried. I didn't think he'd actually… She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. Claire, you paid Jack to kill your husband, Sarah said bluntly. Whether you admit it or not, That's what happened. Claire sobbed uncontrollably, but she didn't deny the accusation. Detective Sarah Carter knew she was close to unraveling the truth, but she also understood that tying Claire Grayson directly to her husband's murder would require more than circumstantial evidence and emotional outbursts. Claire was teetering on the edge of confession, but Jack Thornton, with his arrogance and carefully veiled threats, was a wild card. Sarah needed to break them both, and fast, before they found a way to shift blame entirely onto each other. Claire Grayson sat in the interrogation room, her tears long dried but her composure fragile. Sarah slid the gas station footage across the table. "You handed him money," Sarah stated firmly. "You knew what Jack was planning. You can't keep pretending you were innocent in all of this." Claire shook her head, her voice barely audible. I didn't know he would kill Samuel." "Claire," Sarah interrupted, her tone sharp, "you told me Jack promised to scare Samuel. But look at this footage. That wasn't a spontaneous decision. That was a transaction." Claire's lower lip quivered. She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, visibly struggling with her words. Finally, she whispered, "I thought if I gave him the money, he'd leave us alone." "And when he didn't?" Sarah pressed. "What happened after he left that gas station?" Claire buried her face in her hands. "I don't know. He called me later and said, it was done. I didn't ask questions. I was scared." While Claire grappled with guilt and fear, Sarah's tech team analyzed her phone records. They uncovered a call between Claire and Jack shortly after Samuel's estimated time of death. The audio, though muffled, revealed Claire's panicked voice asking, "What have you done?" followed by Jack's chilling response, "What you asked me to do." Armed with this damning evidence, Sarah returned to Jack's interrogation. She played the recording, letting his own words hang in the air like a noose tightening around his neck. "That doesn't prove anything," Jack sneered. "She was hysterical. I just said what she wanted to hear." "Then explain this," Sarah shot back, pulling out the timeline of financial transactions. "Claire transferred over $20,000 to your account over the past 6 months. Money she claims you blackmailed her for, but I think it's payment for murder." Jack's smirk faltered, his bravado cracking under the weight of evidence. "She's lying," he snapped. "She begged me to do it. Said she'd lose everything if Samuel left her." Sarah leaned forward, her voice low and menacing. "So you admit it then? You killed Samuel." Jack froze, realizing too late that he'd just incriminated himself. His jaw tightened and he leaned back in his chair, silent. In her office, Sarah laid out the case with her team. Claire and Jack were equally culpable, but their stories contradicted each other at critical points. Sarah knew the key to closing the case was identifying who held the power in their twisted relationship. "Claire claims Jack manipulated her," Sarah said, "but she's no innocent victim. She paid him, covered for him, and even tried to deflect suspicion onto her husband's business rivals." One of her colleagues, Detective Ramirez, frowned. "What if she's smarter than we're giving her credit for? She might have set this whole thing up, using Jack as her fall guy." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "It's possible, but either way, we need a confession. Let's put them in a position where they have no choice but to turn on each other." Sarah devised a plan to pit Claire and Jack against each other. She had Claire move to a holding cell within earshot of Jack's, ensuring their conversations could be overheard and recorded. She also planted an officer posing as an inmate, who subtly fed each of them misinformation. To Jack, the plan suggested that Claire was cooperating fully with the police, painting him as the mastermind. To Claire, the same officer hinted that Jack had confessed and blamed her for everything. The tension reached a boiling point when Jack was overheard shouting, "She's the one who wanted him dead. I just did what she asked." Claire, meanwhile, screamed back, "You're a liar. I never told you to kill him." The sting worked. Both suspects, desperate to save themselves, turned on each other. Claire admitted she had been unhappy in her marriage and wanted Samuel gone, but insisted she never intended for Jack to kill him. Jack, on the other hand, claimed Claire was the manipulative force behind the murder, using her money and influence to coerce him. Sarah took their confessions to the district attorney, confident that the mountain of evidence and their own words would lead to convictions for both. With Claire Grayson and Jack Thornton pointing fingers at each other, Detective Sarah Carter faced the daunting task of constructing an airtight case. Each confession revealed more layers of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal, but Sarah needed a clear timeline of events to ensure justice. The trial would hinge on showing exactly how far Claire and Jack had gone to eliminate Samuel Grayson. Sarah's team pieced together the events leading up to Samuel's death. Evidence revealed that Claire had begun her affair with Jack 6 months prior, shortly after meeting him at a local gym. Jack, with a criminal record and a history of manipulation, saw Claire as an easy target. She confided in him about her unhappy marriage, and Jack wasted no time exploiting her vulnerability. Bank records showed consistent transfers from Claire's account to Jack's, each labeled as consultation fees. Sarah suspected these payments were bribes to keep Jack quiet about their affair. However, the larger sum, $20,000, transferred days before Samuel's murder, was undeniably tied to the crime. Claire was desperate to keep her affair hidden, Sarah told her team during a briefing. When she thought Samuel might find out and leave her, she panicked. Jack saw an opportunity to profit, and together they plotted Samuel's downfall. The murder weapon, a gun, was traced back to Jack Thornton. He had purchased it under an alias 2 weeks before Samuel's death. Ballistics matched the bullet found in Samuel's body to the gun, tying Jack directly to the crime. Jack might have pulled the trigger, Sarah noted, but Claire was the puppet master. She handed him the money and gave him the motive. To strengthen their case, Sarah brought in a forensic psychologist who analyzed Claire's behavior. The psychologist concluded that while Claire showed signs of emotional manipulation by Jack, she was not entirely under his control. Claire is calculating, the expert said. She knew exactly what she was doing when she involved Jack. While reviewing surveillance footage from a parking lot near the Grayson residence, Sarah's team discovered an unexpected witness, a neighbor who had seen Jack lurking outside the house on the night of the murder. Sarah interviewed the neighbor, a retired school teacher named Martha Reynolds. "I saw that man, Jack, you said, around 9 p.m., Martha explained. He was pacing near the driveway, like he was waiting for something. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I realize it was odd." Martha's testimony placed Jack at the scene and contradicted his claim that he had only approached the house after receiving a text from Claire. The message he claimed she sent, "He's asleep now," was found to have been deleted from Claire's phone, but recovered through digital forensics. The case against Claire and Jack captured national attention. Headlines labeled it the open marriage murder, and news outlets speculated endlessly about the sordid details of their relationship. Claire hired a high-profile defense attorney who painted her as a victim, arguing that Jack had coerced her into paying him out of fear for her own safety. Jack, on the other hand, took a different approach. Representing himself, he portrayed Claire as a cold, calculating woman who had orchestrated the murder and used him as a pawn. "She promised me love and money," Jack declared in court, "but all she gave me was trouble." Sarah testified as the lead investigator, presenting the mountain of evidence her team had gathered. She recounted the timeline of events, the financial transactions, the surveillance footage, and the recovered text messages. "The evidence shows a partnership," Sarah said firmly during her testimony. "Claire Grayson and Jack Thornton worked together to plan and execute Samuel Grayson's murder. They are equally responsible." After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a decision. Claire and Jack were both found guilty of first-degree murder. Claire received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, while Jack was sentenced to death due to his direct role in the killing. As the courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and applause, Sarah felt a sense of closure. She had uncovered the truth, but the case left a lingering unease. It was a stark reminder of how love, greed, and betrayal could destroy lives. With Claire Grayson and Jack Thornton behind bars, the case that had consumed Detective Sarah Carter's life for months was finally over. The trial's verdict brought a sense of justice to Samuel Grayson's grieving family, but for Sarah, the end of the case was bittersweet. As she sifted through the aftermath, she was left pondering the darker sides of human nature and the ripple effects of betrayal. The Grayson estate, once a symbol of Samuel's success, now stood as a grim reminder of his tragic end. His sister Margaret took over the responsibility of caring for the children, who were too young to fully understand what had happened. Margaret expressed gratitude to Sarah during a brief meeting after the trial. "You gave us closure," Margaret said, "but nothing can replace Samuel. He was a good man." Sarah nodded. "I wish I could have stopped it before it happened, but at least his killers are being held accountable." The children's trauma became a focal point for the family, who sought counseling to help them process the loss of their father and the betrayal by their mother. Jack Thornton's arrogance persisted even in prison. Despite his conviction, he continued to proclaim his innocence, spinning stories of being framed by Claire. His appeals delayed his execution date, but Sarah was confident the overwhelming evidence would ensure justice prevailed. The prison warden informed Sarah that Jack had been placed in solitary confinement after several altercations with other inmates. "He's still trying to manipulate people," the warden said. "Even here, he can't help himself." Sarah wasn't surprised. Jack's nature as a manipulator had been central to the case. Unlike Jack, Claire faded into obscurity within the prison system. The media frenzy around her subsided, and she spent her days quietly, avoiding contact with other inmates. She refused interviews and rarely spoke to anyone, even her lawyers. Sarah visited her once, hoping to understand what drove Claire to such lengths. The meeting was tense, and Claire's demeanor was cold. "I loved him, you know," Claire said suddenly, referring to Samuel. "I just didn't know how to be happy with him anymore." "You had choices," Sarah replied. "You didn't have to destroy him." Claire looked away, her face unreadable. "I guess some people are just born to ruin everything they touch." Back in her office, Sarah sat staring at the case files. The photographs, financial records, and confessions painted a picture of a love story gone horribly wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that the tragedy had been preventable if only someone had noticed the warning signs earlier. Her colleagues encouraged her to take a break, but Sarah found it difficult to detach. The case had reaffirmed her belief in justice, but also left her questioning the fragility of trust and the destructive power of secrets. A small memorial was held for Samuel Grayson in the local park where he used to take his children. Friends, family, and former colleagues gathered to honor his memory. Sarah attended quietly, standing at the back of the crowd. Margaret approached her with a small envelope. "He would have wanted you to have this," she said. Inside was a thank you card written by Samuel months before his death, meant for another occasion but repurposed by the family. The words, though unrelated to the case, reminded Sarah of the good man whose life had been cut short. The case closed, Sarah decided to take a brief leave of absence to recharge. She spent time with her own family, finding solace in the normalcy of their lives. The Grayson case became a haunting chapter in her career, one that would shape her approach to future investigations. Though justice had been served, the scars left by Claire and Jack's actions lingered in the community,